Hey, here's a question I bet nobody asked you before. Why do governments exist? Why do we have governments? How we go about answering this question depends on the sort of answer we're looking for. Are we asking, what is government for? As in, what is the purpose of government? Or are we asking, where does government come from? What are the historical circumstances that led to the existence of government as we know it today? These two different ways of thinking about the question are at the root of many of the disputes that we have over social issues. The first question, what is government for, is a philosophical question, and it has to do with things like who should have institutional power, and whose interests should this power advance and protect? Where does the legitimacy of a government come from? Is the power that governments hold over us legitimate at all? The philosophers who try to answer these questions are not necessarily interested in the historical details of how government took on its current form. They aren't so much questions of a fact as they are should questions, the sort of questions that we construct moral theories to answer and justify. The second approach, on the other hand, is all about historical facts. How did we come to live in a world where some people have power and others don't? What events led to power being concentrated in certain hands, and why these hands and not others? Was it always going to be this way? Or did we get here through a series of decisions? We can't hope to have meaningful discussions about things like rights and what laws should or shouldn't be passed without some understanding of this stuff. Also, these are really interesting questions, and we don't often get a chance to think about them. Are you excited? I'm excited. Roll credits. Wait, what? We don't have an opening credit sequence? Okay, in that case, roll slides. Before we ask why governments exist, we might want to think about what governments are. The concept of a government, as we understand it today, is inextricable from that of the nation state. So when we use the word state nowadays, we usually mean nation state. When I came up with the name for this week's lecture, I called it Liberalism and the State, even though what I wanted to talk about was governments. But when people talk about government, they often speak of the state, often with a capital letter instead. What should be the limits of state power? That sort of thing. And although these concepts are not synonymous, it is difficult to think about one without the other. And the US made things needlessly confusing when they decided to refer to what should have been called provinces or territories as states. When the word state is used properly, it refers to a self-governing political unit. We say that a state has sovereignty in its territory, meaning that it has the power to make laws and decide what happens there. Nobody else gets to tell it what to do. The word nation is frequently used interchangeably with the word state, as in the United Nations, even though these two words are very different in meaning. A nation is a group of people, usually living in a geographically contiguous area, who, on the basis of having certain things in common, like language, culture, or ethnicity, have developed a shared identity that distinguishes them from other nations or peoples. The reason why we confuse the words is because we have come to associate nations, meaning groups of people with a shared identity, with states, sovereign, self-governing territories, assuming either that states are automatically identical with nations or that they should be identical with nations. Consider Canada. We live in a culturally diverse country, but when someone says, I am Canadian, it means something more than just, I live in Canada. Canada is the country that I happen to live in. Does Canada have a national identity? How different are we from Americans, really? I don't know, but we sure think of ourselves as different from Americans. Before, let's say the 19th century, people didn't really think that way. They mostly didn't think that way. They didn't think of themselves as self-governed, and political organization had more to do with power and force than it did identity. To put it in overly simple terms, there were kingdoms and there were empires. They weren't all kingdoms and empires, but there were things that worked like kingdoms. You know what I mean. A kingdom is what it sounds like. A territory ruled over by a hereditary monarch with relatively unlimited authority. An empire is a bunch of different territories, sometimes physically connected, sometimes separated by great distances, such as the British Empire, ruled over by a single territory, like Britain ruled over the British Empire, and the ruling territory might be a kingdom or it might have some other form of government. The idea is it rules over a bunch of different places. So the important difference between the old system of kingdoms and empires versus the system that we have now doesn't have so much to do with national identity as it does with the idea of authority. Authority in political discourse usually has to do with the legitimate exercise of power. Under the old system of kingdoms and empires, authority was more or less synonymous with power. Whether it was considered legitimate depended on whether you were the one with the power or the one without the power. People living in India under British rule probably didn't see the power that the British held over them as legitimate. Likewise, a kingdom has subjects, not citizens. They're subject to the king's power, which may or may not be limited by law, and what keeps them subject is normally either force or the threat of force. So, although kingdoms and empires had a kind of government, it wasn't government as we think of it today. People living under British colonial rule, like in India, didn't complain about government overreach. Everything that the government did was overreach. You could say that they weren't so much governed as ruled. You could also say that what they had in place of government was oppression by power. Of course, it was a bit more complicated than that. In a kingdom, theoretically, the king has all of the power, but a king can't rule over 1,000 or 1,000,000 peasants all by himself. So kings parceled out power in the form of lands and titles in return for pledges of loyalty. Titles like knight and lord, and land because land was where all the wealth came from. These were agrarian societies. We still have the word landlord, meaning the person you pay your rent to, and it's derived from that system. Ordinary people like you and me worked and lived on the land as farmers and gave a share of our crops to the lord of the land in return for not being murdered. We didn't have any rights because we didn't have any power. And also because the concept of rights kind of hadn't developed yet. Peasant revolts were sometimes a thing, but they were rare because peasants weren't allowed to have things like weapons or armor, so that they couldn't revolt. Also, in some places at least, it was customary for lords to be nice to their peasants, giving them days off or occasionally inviting them to feasts or whatever. The main thing that preserved this highly unequal system of affairs, though, was the church. The church, originally meaning the Catholic Church, preached that inequality was natural, that lords and kings were naturally above peasants, as God was above human beings, and human beings were above animals. Also, as men were above women, because the The man was understood as the lord of his household, even if he was a peasant. Here's some guy with a list of the various hierarchies that were preached as natural in Europe during this time period.
According to the dominant ideology in Europe in the Middle Ages, which carries through the Ancien Regime period, the universe was one giant hierarchy, the great chain of being, with God on top, his angels below him, and then the Pope and the worldly monarchs appointed by God below them. And then you had the three orders of human society, the clergy, the nobility, and the common people below them. In terms of hierarchical order on earth, you had the king and the pope on top, the nobility and the high clergy below them, and then the common people and the lower clergy below them. And below them were the animals, and below them the plants, and below them the minerals. And each one of those categories under God had its own hierarchy. The angels were divided into the seraphim, who were ranked above the cherubim, the little sweet cherubs. And then there were different ranks of nobility and of clergy. Men were ranked above women, and adults above children, masters over apprentices, bigger animals over smaller animals.
Okay, that's enough. We don't have all day here. So this system, which was known as feudalism, lasted for a long time in Europe, basically from around the fall of Rome up until, in some cases, the 18th century. But eventually it came under threat due to a number of factors, the most important of which was the slow rise of the mercantile class. These were people who were able to acquire power not through land and titles, but through the accumulation of wealth, i.e., money, mostly acquired through trade. This was able to happen because the kings and lords of the old system liked trade because it also made them wealthy. However, it also fostered the breakdown of the old system in favor of a new way of thinking about society called liberalism. The term liberalism comes from liberty, which is the French word for freedom, but in my opinion, liberalism has more to do with equality than it does with freedom. At the core of liberalism is a rejection of the belief in the natural hierarchies on which the feudal system relied for its legitimacy. If a man can advance his status in society through the sweat of his brow, then how did it make sense that another man was entitled to his status merely through an accident of birth? Liberalism goes along with meritocracy, which is the idea that how much wealth and power you have should be based on your ability or talent as demonstrated by, the things that you actually do, as opposed to who your father was. To us, meritocracy is probably just common sense. But in the history of politics that led to, well, to us, people had to argue for meritocracy. It didn't start out as common sense. Just think of the word common sense. It literally means what most people believe. So if most people believe that social status should depend on birth rather than merit, that's common sense to them. And it's worth mentioning now that common sense, or what poli-sci's call the dominant ideology, does not come about by accident. It's normal for people to believe what they're told, and people are told things for reasons. So the dominant ideology is usually the one that supports or justifies the power structures of the society in question. Or at minimum, it's an or at minimum, it fosters stability. For example, the religious belief that you will be rewarded in the afterlife based on whether or not you follow the rules while you're alive doesn't necessarily support a particular political system, but it does tend to make people go along with whatever system they find themselves in. Therefore, nothing is intrinsically common sense. It's all a matter of what you're used to. Meritocracy became common sense only because a whole lot of long dead philosophers argued for it. Think about it. To you, it's probably common sense that you had to go to university in order to get a job, and it's also common sense that philosophy doesn't have anything to do with the real world of money and jobs, but you only believe this because you grew up in a world where things work the way they do, because a bunch of philosophers successfully persuaded people that the world needed to change. Liberalism, in case you didn't already know, is a specific moral and political philosophy. And it's not only the dominant moral and political philosophy today, the economic and political institutions that determine how everything works in the world today were, to some extent, constructed in line with liberalism. Democracy, for example, is part of liberalism, but liberalism is a much broader concept than democracy, and it can't be explained in a few sentences. Let me spend a couple of sentences telling you what it isn't, however. Liberalism is not the set of beliefs that characterize a particular political party, such as the Liberals in Canada or the Democrats in the United States, in contrast to some opposing party, such as the Conservatives or the Republicans. Liberalism is more foundational than that. To the extent that a political party believes in democracy at all, they are buying into liberalism. Liberalism, the social and political philosophy. There's a lot of talk nowadays about whether the Republican Party in the US is sliding into fascism or whether it already has. And fascism actually is a different and opposing political philosophy to liberalism. But just because some political pundit or your conservative uncle complains about those liberals ruining everything, that doesn't mean that they aren't still thinking inside the framework of liberalism as I'm going to present it here. And the same is true in any philosophy or political studies course that uses the word liberalism. Conservative, as we normally use that word, also believe in liberalism. Your uncle, who worries about liberals transing everybody, still thinks within the framework of liberalism. He might not know how to think outside of it. Get it? Probably. I don't know your uncle. I hear he's really good at Yahtzee, though. The best way to understand liberalism is through the concept of the social contract. You remember at the start of this class, I asked you the question, why does government exist? Well, the social contract is one way to answer that question. And here is somebody tell you all about it.
So the social contract or social contract theory says that communities, political communities, are based on agreements. In every community, people come together and they agree on a set of rules or laws that will govern their life together. The social contract is supposed to be this thing that binds us all together. If you live in a society, you are bound by the social contract. But the really strange thing is that this contract, this document, is essentially imaginary. If you read social contract theorists, they all gesture towards this point in time, this moment in the past when we supposedly all got together and signed this contract. But historically speaking, that never happened. I didn't sign this contract, did you? Consider this. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is one of the most influential social contract theorists, says that laws are merely the record of our own wills. Are they, though? Like, a record of what? When was this record taken? Was I there? Were you there? Was anybody there? But if you live in a modern democracy, your government, the political philosophy that underpins your whole way of life, is based on this imaginary contract that none of us ever signed. There are two reasons why this might be a problem. First, the social contract is supposedly the thing that gives our laws and our governments their legitimacy. These institutions are supposed to have authority over us because we have granted them that authority.
Sorry to interrupt, but if we're going to be talking about politics, I figure we ought to be clear about what this word means. Many unnecessary disputes can be avoided just by making sure we understand the words we're using in the same way. So often when we're talking about politics, we're referring to things like debates in parliament or people running for election. But in academia, you're likely to hear the term used in a more abstract way, often having to do with the distribution of power and resources in society. When people complain about politics being shoved into their video games and Star Wars movies, they're using it in the second sense. That's how Great Books Prof here is using it, and that's how we're going to be using it in this course. Now, the word politics is hard to define. Here on the slide is my definition, which is consistent with the way it's normally used in the social sciences, just with a little extra clarification. So politics means decision-making in groups. In particular, it has to do with who holds decision-making power, how decisions are made, and how decisions are enforced. So anything that affects group-level decision-making can be political. There's nothing inherently political about skin color or gender, but if those things affect one's status in society, they become political. See what I mean? Okay, now back to the social contract.
But if we never really agreed, if we never really granted them that authority, does that call the legitimacy of our laws and governments into question? Maybe we can say that the social contract is just a metaphor. It's not real. It's not meant to be taken that seriously. Political life does often feel like a transaction. The state gives you certain benefits like security and infrastructure. And in exchange, you agree to give up some of your natural liberties. You agree to abide by a certain set of rules and norms. So the state supplies you with roads and fire departments, and you agree not to take off your pants in public or smoke in hospitals or do whatever this guy's doing. And here's the second problem. Even if the social contract is just a metaphor, it's such a foundational metaphor that it still shapes the way we think and talk about politics. Like, one of the premises of the social contract metaphor is that all human beings are motivated primarily, maybe even exclusively, by material self-interest. So we care about our body and we care about our stuff. So the question is, does this metaphor produce a politics that reinforces for us the idea that we're all materialistic and self-interested? So where did the idea of the social contract come from? And why does it have such a powerful hold on us? Let me tell you about that. So our Western conception of the social contract is basically traceable to these three European dudes: Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I'm going to talk a bit about all three of these guys, their various contributions to social contract theory, and then at the end of the video, we'll talk about some critiques and some limitations in their thinking. So let's start with our man Thomas Hobbes. Now, Thomas Hobbes was an early modern empiricist. He was an empirical philosopher. This means he was an early supporter of the scientific method. He was actually, for a time, the secretary of Francis Bacon, who's one of the architects of the scientific method. Hobbes wanted to use this new science, this emergent science, to better understand human nature. Hobbes was especially interested in why we, as natural beings, as animals really, why do we enter into political community? Why does it seem to be in our nature to organize ourselves into political groups? What drives us to do it? And what is it that we hope to get out of our participation in political community? So in his very famous book, Leviathan, from 1651, Hobbes tries to imagine what human beings were like before politics. What are we like in our natural state if we stripped away all the customs and conventions associated with society? You know, if you could restore human beings to their factory default, what would we really look like? And this leads Hobbes on one of the most famous thought experiments in the whole history of Western philosophy, where he invites us to imagine the state of nature. In short, Hobbes argued that outside of politics and society, in our natural state, human life sucked. Without laws to keep us in check, human beings are self-centered, we're predatory and violent. And so, in order to protect ourselves from violence and to keep others from taking our stuff, we agree to sign on to the social contract. That might look something like this. Okay, gentlemen, thank you for coming. Now, our problem is that every time someone around here gets hold of a banana to feed themselves, someone else seizes that banana either by force or fraud. Give me a banana. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. So I've been thinking we need to come to some sort of agreement where we all agree not to hurt each other. I won't do bad things to you. You don't do bad things to me. I won't take your bananas. You don't take my bananas. Sounds good. I'm in. What are you guys doing? Signing a social contract? Yep. No more banana theft. That'll never work. Why not? Give me a banana. We just agreed. I told you. See, the easy part is making the agreement. The hard part is getting people to abide by their agreements. Like making sure they won't actually hurt each other or take each other's stuff. Yeah, full disclosure, I was going to sign the contract and then wait for you guys to fall asleep and then steal all your bananas. That's smart. So what do? We just keep fighting over bananas for the rest of our poor, nasty, brutish, and short lives? You need a sovereign.
A what? What?
A what? A sovereign. So for Hobbes, the sovereign was this kind of amalgamation or conglomeration of the collective will. And crucially, it's imbued with power and authority to make executive decisions for the whole group. The sovereign could take different forms. It could be like a legislative assembly, or it could be like a monarch, like a king or a queen who's placed in a position of authority, some executive decision-making office. And critically, the sovereign is empowered to uphold the social contract and to make sure everyone is abiding by their agreements. For Hobbes, the preservation of your body from danger was really the whole appeal of entering into a social contract. So you wanted a political authority who could make people obey the rules. This is actually what leads Hobbes to the conclusion that the best regime, the regime we all really want, is an absolute monarchy. An absolute monarchy where one person is going to set the agenda, make all the rules, and the rest of us just comply. The rest of us are just obedient. Because even if those rules are unjust or irrational, even if the laws are unjust, we would rather live in that orderly, obedient society than live in the state of nature, where everybody's stealing your bananas. But does that really make sense? Like if you were going to sign a contract to set up a society, would you really sign a contract that gives another person, some guy, absolute power over you and your property? Enter John Locke. John Locke is another very influential social contract theorist, and Locke makes a relatively minor but enormously significant modification to Hobbes's basic philosophical framework. Still believes in the state of nature, still believes in the social contract, but Locke argues that life in an absolute monarchy, where one person has absolute power to decide whether you live or die, who can change the laws at will and act with total impunity, that's really no different than life in the state of nature. Hence, it is evident that absolute monarchy, which by some men is counted the only government in the world, is indeed inconsistent with civil society, and so can be no form of civil government at all. For wherever any two men are who have no standing rule and common judge to appeal to on earth for the determination of controversies of right betwixt them, there they are still in the state of nature. Locke argues that absolute monarchy is out. You either need a republic like the United States, or you need a constitutional monarchy, something like Canada, say, where there's still a monarch, but the powers of the monarch are really limited.
This might be a good moment to tell you about my approach to using YouTube clips in my lectures. This is how it works. If I can find somebody else who says pretty much the same thing that I am going to say, then I would usually rather employ a clip of them saying it just to break up the monotony of you listening to me talk. Also, people like Hank Green and this guy are, in my opinion, more charismatic and engaging than me, so why not have you listen to them instead of making you listen to me? So the concept of the social contract addresses both versions of the question, why does government exist? It answers the philosophical and political question of what government is for, and also the historical question of where do governments come from, or at least it aims to. But as the guy in the video, the name of his channel is Great Books Prof, so let's call him Professor G. As Professor G says, this version of the origin of government is mythical. It's not actually true that one day a bunch of dudes living together in the state of nature sat down and said, let's figure out a system that will stop us stealing each other's bananas. Modern states came into being through a gradual modification of the political systems that already existed. But does this matter? Well, it depends who you ask. There is one well-known modern state whose system of government was constructed from the ground up by a bunch of overeducated white guys sitting around a table. And conveniently, like really conveniently, some of those guys were the same actual people who developed social contract theory as we understand it today. Americans called those people the Founding Fathers, and the country that they created was called the United States of America. You may have heard of it. So, lucky for us, America and its system of government can act as a kind of case study of social contract theory in action. And many people think of it that way. But I feel obliged to tell you that, although the American system of government absolutely was constructed with the principles of liberalism and social contract theory in mind, it's not like in Hobbes's origin story. It wasn't everybody in the nascent nation getting together and devising the social contract, i.e., the founding documents of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, etc. It was just the guys who were already in power. So this wasn't exactly a democratic process. And a sizable chunk of the population that didn't get any say in the social contract and didn't get to consent to it were slaves. So there's that. And there's also the fact that the founding fathers were not exactly living in the state of nature. They were living in a bunch of British colonies. Let's talk about the state of nature for a bit. Hobbes said that before the invention of government, people existed in a war of all against all. Those are his words. And life was, and these are famously his words, and life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So who exactly were these people who lived at some unspecified point in the past and then invented government? It's tempting to think that Hobbes is thinking of Aboriginal peoples here, right? Like the Australian Aborigines or the few hunter-gatherer tribes that still exist in Africa and the South Pacific. They don't have governments. They're not civilized, at least not in Hobbes's view. He'd call them savages. Also, they do literally live in nature, you know, savanna, desert, forest. Now, those are modern people, obviously, and we can't be sure that our ancestors had a similar way of life to them, but there's also archaeological evidence, and most anthropologists are agreed that they probably did, that they probably were basically the same as modern hunter-gatherers. So let me ask you, are their lives, the lives of the present day hunter-gatherers, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short? Well, no. Except for times of famine or when colonizers try to kill them, their lives are quite nice. They're not particularly violent, at least not within their social groups. They help each other out with taking care of children and other sorts of work. They make music and art. And something that's very important from our perspective specifically, their society is very egalitarian, meaning there's very little inequality. Hunter-gatherers may, in fact, be the only kind of societies in which men and women have equal status, or very nearly equal status, remarkably equal. Not all hunter-gatherer societies are like this. Some of them suck. Generally speaking, though, what Hobbes described was more or less the opposite of the facts. People seem to be, if not better off before government existed, then at least there was no apparent need for them to create government. So what the fuck happened? Although obviously we can't know with certainty what happened, there is a widely accepted story which I am going to summarize to you right now. First, agriculture happened. Agriculture, by which I mean farming, made possible something that had never existed before in human history, or prehistory, I guess, since technically the word history refers to written history. Anyway, something that had never existed before, wealth disparity. Because people were no longer restricted to what they could carry, And because agriculture made possible a surplus of food and the specialization of labor so that people could learn how to do metalworking and stuff, rare and hard to make products existed and were in demand. It was now possible for the first time for some people to own quite a lot more stuff than other people. In a sense, this was when the concept of property was born. Think about how we use the word property. We can use it to refer to things that you own generally, but there's another sense of the word property where it refers specifically to land that you own. My house sits on a piece of property, right? Before people settled down and became farmers, they were nomadic. So the stuff that you owned, i.e., your property, was the stuff that you carried on your person or that you normally carried on your person. I mean, people took baths, they took off their clothes and stuff. The idea of property as something other than the physical control you had over objects close within reach was abstract and weird. Think about how the European settlers were able to swindle Native Americans out of huge tracts of land because the Native Americans didn't believe that land was something that could be owned. In fact, land can't be owned without the power of government to back up your property claims. So that's one answer to why government exists, so that people can own things like land and factories and mines, things that other people could take away from them if they didn't have the coercive power of the state to stop that from happening. But what does all this have to do with liberalism?
Maybe it doesn't matter that there wasn't actually a moment when we all signed the contract. Maybe it's just a metaphor. Look, it's just a way of talking about political life and living together, and a way of thinking about our obligations to one another, what we owe to each other. The real utility of the social contract as a metaphor for politics is that it focuses our attention on the collective and collaborative nature of politics. And it also teaches us that political legitimacy, that the legitimacy of a government depends upon agreement and consent. This is what makes the social contract such a persuasive account in democratic contexts, especially. When we think of a government that's for the people and by the people, we think of a government that is created by the agreement of the people.
Remember when I said that under the previous model of government, kingdoms and empires, authority was basically synonymous with power? What kingdoms and empires have in common is that they're both forms of tyranny, meaning that they are government without the consent of the governed. Under liberalism, the only legitimate authority comes from the consent of the people. The government, at least in theory, represents you or me as much as it does the people in the offices of power. When people in the government do use their power for personal gain, we call it corruption. Now, I know there's a lot of corruption in modern democracies, but what makes our situation different from tyrannical systems of government is that we at least have the concept of corruption. Corruption is understood as something bad. It's not just business as usual. And we have a system of laws and courts that are supposed to prevent and punish corruption. And sometimes they even work. Liberalism is the idea that there should be rule of law, not rule of power. Liberalism is the idea that we get to impose conditions on our consent to be ruled. Conditions like fundamental human rights. Governments are not allowed to make laws that violate human rights, and our political systems are set up to keep that from happening. Remember last week when I talked about utilitarianism and Kantian ethics, and I said that the concept of rights comes from Kantian ethics and they act as a check on utilitarian thinking? This is how that actually works in modern democracies. A majority of people could decide that, say, if you get pregnant, you have to carry the baby to term, no abortions, and they pass a law. But that law would violate your right to control what happens inside your own body, and the documents that determine how our government works, including the limits of government power, say that's not allowed. So this law would be declared invalid and struck down, usually by the courts. Another condition of the social contract is equality under the law. Since we're all theoretically signatories to the social contract, then it's the same contract for everyone. No one gets preferential treatment. Now, there's some dispute here. Some argue that liberalism means more than equality under the law. It entails laws and policies that promote actual equality. Public schools, for example, ensure that everybody gets a basic level of education, even if they can't pay for it. This is supposed to level the playing field. It's actively trying to promote equality. Government-sponsored student loans exist for the same reason. Did you know that in some countries, such as the Netherlands, university is free under certain conditions? Isn't the Netherlands great? Free university and public nudity? It's like they're living in the Star Trek future. As originally formulated by people like John Locke on the previous slide, liberalism said that equality under the law was enough. Government did not have to, and maybe even shouldn't, actively promote equality by, say, legislating equal pay for equal work. This view has come to be called classical liberalism because later thinkers in the same tradition decided, for various reasons that we will get into in future classes, societies do not achieve the goals of liberalism in any version if governments take a purely hands-off approach. Modern liberalism is somewhat confusingly called liberalism. You'd think that it would be called something like neoliberalism, but neoliberalism means something else. And what it means is something a whole lot like classical liberalism, actually. So it's a kind of moving backwards. We might have a chance to talk about that in a future class too. The reason why I'm giving you a slide full of terminology, even though no, Mia, what? Stop it. We've already seen this episode. No reruns. Now, although the ideas of liberalism, like fundamental human rights and the authority of states coming from the consent of the governed, came from philosophers like Locke and Rousseau, the rise of liberalism has a lot to do with another ism that shaped the world that we live in today, capitalism. I said earlier that the decline of feudalism and the rigidly hierarchical worldview that went with it started with the rise of the mercantile class. By this I mean commoners, people who were at the bottom of the birth-based feudal hierarchy, who were able to acquire wealth through trade and in some cases become as powerful as kings. Meanwhile, kings themselves became dependent on the merchants who conducted trade and sometimes borrowed large sums of money from them to pay for armies and things. In fact, the mercantile class became so powerful that they were able to demand the same rights as the nobles, and eventually the whole feudal system of different rights and duties, depending on your place in the feudal hierarchy, was done away with. And this applied to ordinary commoners as well, not just the rich ones, giving the beginning of equality under the law. There were other factors as well, but what's important for our purposes is that class, how materially well off you were in society and how much influence you had, became mainly about wealth. The liberalism of John Locke, in particular, said that governments had two jobs: protecting individual liberty and protecting private property. This sounded good to the growing class of people who acquired wealth through owning property that generated wealth, such as mines and later factories. There was enormous money to be made off things like trade and colonialism. Liberalism was all about freedom, and capitalism was all about free markets. Essentially, liberalism created the essentially liberalism created the wow. Essentially, liberalism created the ideal environment for capitalism to flourish, and many social scientists consider this to be a major factor in the spread and eventual dominance of liberalism. So does this mean we have capitalism to thank for all these freedoms that were guaranteed in liberal democracies like Canada? Well, yes. Well, partly yes. But as capitalism became the primary mode of production, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, which also wouldn't have happened without capitalism, by the way, wealth inequality increased, and some people began to wonder if we had simply exchanged the oppression of the common folk by the feudal lords for the oppression of the working class by the capitalists. This is a thread that we will pick up in a future lecture. Mark stands, stay tuned. There is also a second, more abstract way that liberalism tends to be allied with capitalism. Remember when Professor G said that the metaphor of the social contract fostered a certain view of what it is to be a person? Rational, self-interested, and most of all, independent. And isn't it interesting that the image that we have, our primary foundational image for how politics works in the modern world, is the contract? Like the contract that you have with your internet provider. It's an intrinsically capitalist notion. Liberalism conceives individual people as atomistic, as free, fully formed, and without ties or obligations apart from the ones that we enter into through formal and informal contracts. This is basically the same way that capitalism conceives of people. Philosophers call this the liberal subject. But I'd like to suggest that, like the social contract, the liberal subject is a kind of fiction. After all, humans have always lived in communities. We're not really all that rational, and independence is largely an illusion. You might think of yourself as a unique individual, but all of your ideas came from somewhere. You sort of picked them out of a buffet of possibilities offered by your culture. If you're a nonconformist, I bet you nonconform in the usual ways that nonconformists do, and you probably signal it with signs like clothing or piercings or other things that people can easily recognize. You likely have strong emotional ties to your family or other people. You may have loyalties to people you've never met, like celebrities or streamers or sports teams, and you're full of biases related to those things. People think they're independent when they have enough money to pay for everything they need, but the truth is, money only conceals your dependence upon others. You may have your own car, but what happens when it breaks down? You also have to put fuel in your car, which you have to get from gas stations, which have to get it from oil producers. Maybe you own your own house, but you didn't build the house, did you? And your house needs to be supplied with electricity and water and stuff, all of which are provided by systems that employ lots of people and involve technology that needs to be built and maintained by other people, and so on. Take away all of these people, and your money is worthless. The fact that you pay a person or an institution for your gas or electricity or whatever doesn't mean you aren't dependent upon these other people and systems. Finally, the image of the liberal subject freely entering into contracts ignores the power dynamics that pervade society. Sure, you're free to enter or not enter into a contract with your internet provider, but what if they're the only internet provider in your area? You theoretically negotiate a contract with your employer on equal terms, but what if you really need this job and there are a dozen other applicants that your employee can choose from? If your alternative to working a job is dying on the street, it doesn't seem like such a free choice anymore. And although liberalism says that we all have the same rights and privileges, this means that it ignores things like race, class, and gender, which have a big effect on how people see you and the opportunities available to you. This is also something that we will be pursuing in a later class. You see, if you're going to understand the issues that we argue about, and if you're going to make sensible choices in life, you need to understand the society that we live in. And it turns out that in order to understand it, you have to understand where it came from, how it got to be the way it is today, as well as the forces that shaped it and continue to shape it. That is what this next component of the course, starting with the lecture that you've just watched, is going to be all about. This lecture is over now. Why are you still watching?